communication is autoantibodies to nuclear Valosin-containing protein-like, a novel systemic sclerosis-related antibody, and we will be presented by Janire Perurena-Prieto from Hospital Vall d'Hebron.
Thank you for the introduction. Systemic sclerosis is an autoimmune disease of unknown etiology characterized by inflammatory and fibrotic processes involving mainly the skin, microcirculation, and several internal organs. As systemic sclerosis is a highly heterogeneous disease, classification criteria are fundamental to establish the prognosis of different patients. Leroy criteria were one of the first established classification criteria for these patients, and broadly speaking, according to these criteria, these patients can be classified in two different subsets, the limited cutaneous subset and the diffuse cutaneous subset. This classification is made according to the skin thickening extension of these patients. In the limited cutaneous form, the skin thickening can be found distal to the elbows and knees, while in the diffuse cutaneous form, it can also be found proximal to the elbows and knees. These two different subsets had been associated with different internal organ involvement. While the diffuse cutaneous form is associated with a more severe internal organ involvement that might develop within weeks or months, the limited cutaneous form is more associated with a clinical stable course. Anyhow, systemic sclerosis-specific autoantibodies are not only useful for the diagnosis, but also for predicting the clinical course of different systemic sclerosis patients. And they have shown that they can predict better some clinical manifestations than the criteria that we have just seen. For example, normally the patients within the limited cutaneous subset present pulmonary arterial hypertension, but patients with anti-U11, U12, RNAP autoantibodies present this subset, but they present severe interstitial lung disease. Patients with anti-RNA polymerase-free autoantibodies normally present the diffuse cutaneous form of the disease, but they also present cancer, while patients with anti-SCL70 autoantibodies present this diffuse cutaneous form of the disease, but they don't present cancer. So it has been reported that antinuclear autoantibodies are detectable in 90–95% of systemic sclerosis patients, but in a group of patients of our cohort, no specific autoantibodies are found. So our hypothesis is that this group of patients might present autoantibodies that has been not previously described in this disease. And the aim of this study was to describe these new systemic sclerosis-specific autoantibodies by a novel protein immunoprecipitation assay. So to accomplish our objective, we tested systemic sclerosis-specific autoantibodies by a commercial immunoblot in 307 patients of our cohort. 239 were at least positive for one of these autoantibodies, but 68 were negative. And these 68 patients were tested by a RNA immunoprecipitation assay, that is the gold standard assay for detecting antifibrillary, anti-TH2, and anti-U11, U12 RNAP autoantibodies. And 16 patients were positive by this assay, but 52 remained negative. We have 51 samples from these 52 patients available for further analysis by protein immunoprecipitation. Instead of using the traditional protein immunoprecipitation assay that relies on the use of radioisotopes for the metabolic labeling, we used a novel protein immunoprecipitation assay that is based on the bioorthogonal metabolic labeling. Briefly speaking, we grown K562 cells until we reached a very high number of cells, and we incubated these cells in a media without methionine, at which acidoamolanin was added. Acidoamolanin is an analog of methionine with an acido group. So when cells are incubated with media without methionine, but with this analog, the protein synthesis machinery of the cells incorporates this analog on the proteins instead of the methionine. In this way, we get proteins that are labeled with this acido group, and if we make a protein extract from these K562 cells, we obtain these proteins that are labeled. On the other hand, we incubated cephalous protein A bits with the sera of the patients, And this protein A that is in the cephalous beads binds the antibodies that are present in the sera of all the persons, including healthy donors. And we get beads that are coated with these antibodies. So we incubate these coated beads with the protein extract with these proteins that are labeled with the acido group. And if there is an autoantibody, this autoantibody might recognize some of the protein extract. A healthy donor will have antibodies that will coat this bead, but they will never recognize a protein from this extract because this protein extract comes from a human line cell. So in fact, this protein extract serves as an autoantigen repertoire. After the immunoprecipitation, we incubate an alkene group that is attached to a tantra fluorophore, and we perform a click reaction in which the alkene group and the acido group gets combined in a way that the fluorophore gets attached to the protein. So we obtain proteins that are labeled with a fluorophore. After this click reaction, we perform a desnaturalization process, and after that we run an SDH page, so we can see the proteins that are labeled with these fluorescents. So here you can see some of the results that we obtained. In the first line, you can see a healthy donor where no specific bands can be found because a healthy donor should not recognize any protein from the protein extract. In the second line, you can see an anti-SCL70 positive control where you can see a band of around 110, 115 kilodaltons. That is what is described. That is the band corresponding to topoisomerase 1. We found 5 patients that presented a very similar band, but slightly fainter and slightly smaller. So we thought that probably these 5 patients presented a new autoantibody, but we wanted to discard that it was not in fact an faint anti-SCL70 autoantibody. So we did a mass spectrometry analysis of these 3 bands from the anti-SCL70 positive control and patient 15 and 22. And we obtained these results. The patient with the positive control, immunoprecipitated topoisomerase 1, what we expected, but the other 2 patients, 15 and 22, immunoprecipitated NVL. That corresponds to nuclear Valosin-containing protein-like, that is 95 kilodalton nuclear ATPase of the AAA family involved in the biogenesis of the ribosome and telomerase assembly. So with this, as you can see, this NVL protein has the molecular weight that we are seeing on the gel. So we concluded that, and also in the 2 patients, 15 and 22, in the mass spectrometry analysis, we didn't find any trace of SCL70, so we concluded that in fact we were in front of a not previously described autoantibody in systemic sclerosis against NVL. Here you can see the indirect immunofluorescence of the 5 patients that are homogeneous nucleolar on F2 cells, where you can see the nucleolus stained, as it's logical because NVL is a nucleolar protein. And as an example, you can see the immunofluorescent pattern of the anti-SCL70 positive control that presents the typical topo1 pattern. So after that, we decided to see if these autoantibodies could define a new phenotype on systemic sclerosis patients, and we saw that all the patients with this antibody met the criteria of ACR and EULAR, and all presented the limited cutaneous form of the disease. They were significantly older at disease onset, but more importantly, all of them presented with calcinosis, 3 of them with recalcitrant calcinosis, and even more importantly, it was found a very high association of this autoantibody with cancer and synchronous cancer. So we may think that patients with this autoantibody should be followed up more carefully. So nuclear Valosin-containing protein-like, as I have said, is an ATPase of the AAA family involved in the biogenesis of the ribosome and telomerase assembly. And it has been shown that it interacts with PMSTL complex and nucleolin to perform its function. These three proteins, telomerase, nucleolin, and the proteins from the PMSTL complex, all of them have been involved in the development of malignancy, and also they have been described as autoantibody targets in systemic sclerosis patients. So maybe these anti-NVL autoantibodies develop due to an aberrant expression of NVL in malignant cells, or maybe there is an epitope spreading from targets of the same macromolecular complexes. It could be said that 5 patients are not a lot of patients, but anti-NVL autoantibodies were found in 1.6% of all of the patients of the cohort, with a similar prevalence to other systemic sclerosis specific autoantibodies as antifibrillarin or as anti-THTO. So we should take it into account. And as conclusions, NVL has been identified as a new potential autoantibody target on systemic sclerosis patients. Patients identified as anti-NVL positive presented calcinosis and malignancy. And we have developed a new protein immunoprecipitation assay that misses the need of radioisotopes for metabolic labeling. And finally, as some future directions, a more specific assay should be performed in all patients identified as anti-NVL positive by protein immunoprecipitation to confirm that the 110 and 115 kilodalton band is in fact NVL. Anti-NVL autoantibodies should be tested in other autoimmune systemic diseases and conditions to evaluate if they are specific for systemic sclerosis or not. And the clinical phenotype of anti-NVL positive patients should be confirmed in other cohorts of systemic sclerosis patients. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And if I'm not wrong, let's say after the 2 screening methods, you had 52 patients negative, but only 51 samples. And from these 51 samples, you found 5 patients with the same band in the immunoprecipitation. What about the other patients?
Well,
two questions. Did you find another bands maybe interesting to study? And what about the antinuclear patterns? Were all nucleolar or were mixed with other patterns?
We found a lot of different bands, but they were not repetitive in more than one patient. So we centered our efforts in these 5 patients that were like, okay, this is a group of patients, so we will have some clinical associations and not one patient or the 2 patients. We found also one patient that presented I don't know how to say it in English because I always say it in Spanish, but RUF-BEL 1-2, that it's a not common autoantibody, but it was only one. And the other question, there was a lot of immunofluorescence patterns, like different immunofluorescence patterns in this group. And I think they were 9 that were nucleolar. So more than half of the patients with a nucleolar pattern of these 51 patients that were tested by this protein immunoprecipitation assay presented this autoantibody. But there were also speckles, the RUF-BEL 1 was a speckled pattern and other patterns.
May I ask you? It was really nice presentation, and I was a bit puzzled by your autoantibodies and then the link to malignancies. You speculated already a bit about it, but do you think that's a direct link of the antibody to the malignancy or an indirect link?
Well, what it has been, I don't know the answer, I think, but what it has been described is like in diseases like this, where the cancer, for example, we see that 2 patients is a synchronous cancer because the cancer developed at 8 months and the other one was 1.5 years after the first clinical presentation of the disease. So probably there is a connection, but it's not, for me, I don't know the answer.
Any other question? So thanks. I always thought that the Sclerosis-70 it was because it was a 70 kD protein.
No.
It turns that it's not.
Well, in fact, I think it's.
But actually, this is a 95, but it runs over 120.
And STL is a
I guess it's
85.
okay.